David, thanks for sitting down with me today. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
David, you are the famous blogger, the Risk Monger, right? We've been introduced to this, and we've seen a lot about you. You're here at the ESA Congress, chatting with the folks here. You are taking I think a science favorable approach. Is that a reasonable way to describe it? Yeah. Science favorable approach. Can you tell us a little bit about where did this come from? What got you started on the Risk Monger blog?
Well, it really started at when you go back to the time of REACH and the revision of the pesticides directive and the whole GMO regulatory mess that Brussels still finds itself in today, where I started to find that there was a lot more fear than evidence coming into the debates. And so I want to take a counterintuitive approach and just sort of put the facts into a context, and particularly around concepts like the precautionary principle, which was not being used as its ideal was to restore trust in science, but rather to make people more afraid and doubtful of what science was doing. And when I saw the bee issue, particularly colony collapse about 5 years ago, I saw that as an area that was quite rich and ripe for precaution, and it was a question of which campaigners would use it, whether it would be related to GMOs, whether it would be related to the fears of electromagnetic fields, whether it was related to climate change, pesticide use. It was a potpourri of opportunities, and you should never waste a good crisis. And so I saw this as a precaution-rich debate, and I predicted that it would be the pesticide industry that would pay heavily for the loss of bees or the risk of bees. And so I've been able to sort of play out this debate and remind people that evidence matters.
Evidence matters. I like that. Well said. Speaking of tweetable, that sounds like a tweetable component.
But evidence is not anecdote.
Evidence is not anecdote. It is very true. I think the thing that we've learned is you don't hesitate to call a spade a spade.
That's one of the difficulties we see today a lot is industry they have codes of conduct and ethical codes they have to respect, and unfortunately other players in the game are not playing by the same rules, in particular the organic industry, who are funding quite a bit of critical research and quite honestly not fair play in trying to take market share from conventional farming. I'm not bound by any sort of corporate rules and ethical conduct. So when I see what some of these rather unethical lobbyists are doing, I don't mind taking a swing at them.
Right, perfect. Well, I can tell you that we in industry appreciate it. We're here at the ESA Congress, and you're talking about seed treatments and communication and how that all fits together. Can you tell us a little bit? You mentioned some of the topics that you've weighed in on, and neonics is certainly on your list. Can you talk a little bit about what your take is on the neonic ban? We heard today $660 million affected farmers in Europe. Can you tell us how you weigh in on this and why you think that ban should have never happened?
Well, I mean, the most shocking figure is the data that ESA released from their surveys that showed that in the oilseed rape winter planting this year, it's down 50% overall across Europe. That's 50% less pollen-rich crop that the bees will not be able to have overwintering. So what you have in a sense is going to be a weakening of the bee population, which then of course leaves them more susceptible to varroa mite, which the scientific community has concluded is responsible for 85% of that. Now, when you look at it though, the whole debate about neonics has been a sort of a travesty of the way Brussels is supposed to be working. Just to explain a little bit of the story, EFSA had a bee risk assessment working group that designed a bee guidance document which was meant to be presented as the new way to do and conduct field trials for risk assessments on bees. The group that conducted did not have any industry players, didn't have any people actually doing field trials on bees, and in particular 2 people had no experience at all on bees of the 5 members. 2 others were involved and engaged in activist groups campaigning to ban pesticides to save the bees, including one person in particular who was just a postdoc who was campaigning and signing petitions, for example, for Pesticide Action Network North America's letter to the to Obama's pollinator committee. So you had a group that had no interest at all in creating a fair document. So the bee guidance document today actually is impossible and unworkable. It's a draft, by the way, which is not accepted yet, but as a draft document, it was the basis for the EFSA decision that the neonicotinoids were not, there was insufficient data. It was insufficient data because the requirements set up by the bee risk assessment were impossible to comply with. You would need to track bees over a area of 168 square kilometers, which is the equivalent of 31,000 football fields. Okay, bees may go and forage over a range of 31 football fields, but 31,000 was a little bit excessive. It was expecting to have in this document as well a mortality rate of 7% during the time of the studies. The average bee mortality rate is 15%. So if they didn't comply, all the studies were thrown out, and so all the studies were thrown out, which means that EFSA then said we had insufficient data. Okay, and then 2 months after that, the ban was pushed through. I've never seen precaution pushed through within 2 months. So there was also an interest within DG Senko, it's Santena, the Director General related to health. There was an interest to push this through and to ban these products. So this smells.
Right. Smells not so great.
Yeah.
So what needs to change in the minds of government policymakers to help get us on the right page in this dialogue?
Well, there needs to be dialogue, first of all. There isn't. And on top of that, there needs to be a good use of the available research and evidence that's out there. At the moment, you have groups that are, quite activist-driven, presenting a lot of data and being quite loud about the issues. And you've got, we have 800 researchers here today all working in the area of seed research. I could go around and ask them, have you been involved, have you shared your information or research with EU decision makers? The answer would be no, because the people producing the evidence and the research are not being asked. The people who are campaigning are bringing their researchers there. I gave a presentation to the House Agricultural Committee in Washington in April called 50 Shades of White, which was simply trying to advise policymakers how to spot a real scientist from other shades or white coat activists. And it was good fun. If your researcher shows up with a public relations manager, chances are he's not actually going to present you with the best research. If your researcher shows up, or if he publishes his paper in on a website before it's published in a journal, chances are that the evidence is more political than scientific. And so we're seeing that today. We're seeing what I call the rise of the activist scientist. A conventional scientist will look at the evidence and draw a conclusion. An activist scientist will start with the conclusion and look for the evidence. And in this case, on the bees in particular, but also elsewhere, there are scientists, I use the word scientists rather roughly here, who are just trying to prove what their campaign is set up to be. And with the ban on neonicotinoids, particularly with the IUCN Task Force on Systemic Pesticides, this was a case of some rogue activist scientists, but they're successful.
So what can the seed industry specifically do? I mean, we know we have to tell our story. Mm-hmm. How do we properly do that in Europe to get the message across?
Well, at the moment you're telling a story about what you do, which is quite complicated research and science, and a lot of people are not really understanding or scientifically literate today. So I think it's important to try to explain it from that point, but it's not so much what you do, but why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the benefits, and it's benefits related that people think of today. Precaution only works when people don't see the benefits. You're facing a world where food security, global food security is increasing, and you need to be able to find a way to produce more, a higher yield on less land as well because of threats to biodiversity. You're dealing with a world of climate change where they could also deal with soil erosion, soil nutrient depletion, as well as water scarcity. some amazing research coming out, and just walking around the exhibit halls today and talking to the people, I was fascinated to see what they're doing. It's not so much the technology and the techniques, it's more the question of why they're trying to solve these problems that are important. And I don't think the public sees that.
They don't see it because we don't tell it to them, do we?
I'm afraid you spend a lot of the time answering other people's stories, trying to explain why your products are safe when they're raising issues about whether or not it's natural or not. And the minute you respond to somebody else's story, you're not telling your own.
I think it would be safe to say that it's a fact that Europe tackles technology as it relates to food differently than the rest of the world. Fair enough to say?
It's an interesting place. I think one of the points we have to keep in mind is that food is cultural, and in Europe you have 28 member states, but on top of that, within each member state you have differences. Just travel across Italy and you'll see how many different ways they serve pasta. So you will get obviously different interests coming out, and of course competitive interests across Europe. Secondly, food is personal. It goes inside my body, inside my children's body. You don't get more personal than that. And I think one of the things we have to remember is that when you get something that personal and that so intuitive to somebody's very being, there is that fear element coming in easily, and we have to be very sensitive to that.
Agreed. So what do we do to get consumers and media kind of on a track, a conversation? I believe the word used was dialogue, a dialogue that gets us having those conversations that are not just, they will always be some emotional base to them, but how do we get them so that they're not just emotional based conversations?
Well, there are quite clearly a lot of benefits to the research that's going on, and I think that's one of the important things that people need to see. They need to see that more clearly. They need to see how the research is meant to be for the betterment of society, not for the threat of society. And these are stories that have to be told not just by the researchers. The farmers need to tell the stories. The food manufacturers need to tell the stories. It needs to come from many different sources. Unfortunately, the food chain is very deeply integrated. The seed that goes into the ground goes onto my fork, and every step along the way there needs to be coordination. The communication on the food chain is not. People here today who are doing seed research communicate maybe with the farmers. The manufacturers are communicating with the consumers. They don't communicate with the farmers. There is many points of disjunction along the food chain. I think what's important is that every step of the research along the food chain has to communicate, has to ensure that the positions are clearly put out. There is, within the organic industry, a very clear integrated communication lobbying chain that fits. The organic farmer speaks at the market in the same way that the organic retailers do. The organic scientists they're all speaking with one voice and very clear. That's missing within the conventional food chain, and that's one of the problems. Is we create weaknesses that other groups can pick off.
Is there respect for the farmer now? And really where my question is heading is there enough respect for the farmer right now from society, from the buying public, to listen to what they have to say?
I grew up on a farm, and I knew very well what farmers faced every day. In fact, I got into the whole field of risk and risk management because, quite simply, farming is the most essential risk management profession there is. You literally bet the farm every year on the seeds you choose, and if you choose badly, there's no sympathy for you, really. Unfortunately, there's this sort of image of the farmer now that's being painted as in the conventional farmer I'm referring to, as the industrial farmer, the factory farm, someone who picks up and drop kicks chickens 200 meters type of thing. So it's the image is portrayed as really quite vile. Of course, it's being foiled against the organic farmer who cares about you, who cares about your health, who is not interested in making profits like that evil conventional farmer who's just dumping chemicals down the throat of Mother Nature for their own benefit. And this, of course, it outrages farmers when they hear this. Generally, these are cosmopolitan zealots who are quite interested in some political goals rather than actually improving the situation for farmers. And I think when it comes down to the point of what we can do, it's quite simple. Visit a farm. Find farmers who are very communicative. Find a way that people can go out and see what's being done. See how precision agriculture is changing the way the farming is being done, the benefits of it. See the challenges they're facing. I mean, people who can talk about food and agriculture without ever visiting a farm, they're quite interesting, the things that they think actually when you ask them pointed questions.
Their perspective changes very dramatically with one visit. I've seen it many times myself. It changes dramatically with one visit. That whole "I didn't know" comes bubbling up to the surface.
Yep.
Today, when you're talking to the group, I suspect that one of the things everyone's going to be listening for is solutions. We've talked a little bit about today. Is there anything else that you see that needs to be put forward, dialogued about, to get us back onto a page where, because I would suggest we're not on level footing, we're the underdog right now, so to speak. How do we make that adjustment?
There's this process of denormalization of industry going on, particularly industries that are considered the old industries. Tobacco industry, of course, is the best example. Now, tobacco is still legal, but the tobacco industry scientists are not allowed to present evidence. Tobacco lobbyists are strictly monitored. There is no real ability for the tobacco industry to be part of the normal community. Well, that's becoming more and more the trend to denormalize other industries. So the chemical pesticides industry, biotech, we're seeing this also within the pharmaceutical industry now, where people are feeling that companies that are producing life-saving drugs are no longer allowed to have their scientists present evidence. And this blacklisting of industry and this sort of denial of access to participate in the process is creating quite an interesting challenge for research, because a lot of the best researchers are working for industry and they're producing very good work that, simply put, is marked off as industry research and discarded. And I think one of the things we have to do is stop this witch hunt against industry. Stop this sense that if you've been funded by industry in the last 10 years, you're no longer a credible person. This has got to stop, because you cannot simply ignore the main innovators and the main solution providers of society.
Do we have to be loud, or do we have to be consistent, or do we have to be both?
The danger of being loud, of course, when industry gets loud, people get really afraid because the perceptions and prejudices that are really ingrained now in the general public's perception. Consistency, I think, is important. One of the problems, of course, is that industry is also competitive. You have companies that if one company has a problem with a product being banned or blacklisted, it's an opportunity for the competitors. So I think consistency is important. If you speak with a single voice, the regulators would hear it. If everyone's speaking with many different voices, then the policymakers will choose their path of least resistance. Whatever's expedient works better for them.
Agreed. I can tell you have some very open ears. Looking forward to hearing from you, and a very refreshing conversation. I appreciate your time today, Dave.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.